call, and for all of you to know that this webinar is being recorded so that we can post it later on the LiveRoute YouTube channel, as well as our webpage for any people that want to review the content later on or have not had the possibility to join this call live. So good morning, everybody. My name is Lonnie, and I'm very pleased to have you all here with us this morning as we discuss this webinar, which is number 4 in our series. And we're going to be discussing Microsoft Azure. So we're going to do an overview about this Microsoft Cloud service. It is a very, very broad platform, and so we're going to be covering off a lot of the different possibilities that you have with Microsoft Azure without really going into any deep dive on any of the topics here. And expect to see in future webinar sessions where we will take some of the more popular or important features that you can use in Microsoft Azure and to do more of a deep dive in it. Okay, so thank you. We'll be speaking for about 1 hour's time, and you have the opportunity to ask your questions, or if at the end of the call you want to wait for that, or just contact us separately, please feel free to do so. So with that, let's get started right away. We have a lot of material to cover. A quick introduction for those people on the call that are not familiar with us. LiveRoute is a cloud company that really started in 2009 with its only goal of providing cloud-based solutions to our customers. And we were the launch partner with Microsoft for Office 365 at GITEX in 2011. And since then, we have really consolidated ourselves to be Microsoft's top partner. We now have over 100 customers successfully migrated to the cloud using a combination of services such as Office 365, Azure, Intune, and as well as third-party applications that have been added on top to provide additional value to this Microsoft stack, basically enhancing and expanding the functionality. So we have a local team here based out of Dubai, and we'd be more than happy to speak to you if what you're looking for is to explore how you can leverage cloud technologies for your business, including doing things like cloud workshops for you, as well as total cost of ownership analysis, which is a very important exercise to go through when you're building your business case for management. All right, so when we look at what is the traditional way that we have procured IT resources for our data center, generally we've had to always have this upfront capital expenditure. We buy our hardware, we buy our storage, we buy our licenses. For the hardware especially, we typically have to wait 6 to 8 weeks for the delivery time, and we try to plan for our infrastructure based on what we think our computing requirements, what our load is going to be. And so this is represented by this step orange line that you can see in this chart here. The problem with this approach, of course, is that the actual forecast requirements, the load requirements, is never going to be just linear. It's going to be, seasonal for many organizations, especially if you are in, let's say you're in retail, where you might have perhaps more activity during holiday seasons. And for other organizations, the holiday seasons means lack of activity. So obviously, each organization's load requirements are going to be different. But from the IT perspective, the IT team tries to plan for this. And when you believe you're getting close to capacity, maybe you're at 70, 80% capacity, you're now planning your budgets, you are making the purchases and waiting the lead time it is to get the equipment delivered to you. Then you rack it, you configure it, add the storage that you require, purchase your licenses, etc. So this is a very traditional approach of looking at how we procure IT computing power. And of course, it takes a long time. It also is not very exact, right? So you can see that from the purple line that we have here about actual load, we have these issues where, we have the initial investment in the beginning where we want to ensure that we have the proper amount of computing power for our requirements. And generally, because we never want to be at a risk of not having enough computing power, we have the issue of oversupply. We have bought X amount of servers, and some of them are not being used, so they're sitting there idle. The problem is, of course, is that if we do not plan properly and the load starts to increase and we've not procured more server hardware, then we get the problem of undersupply. And this undersupply is a big problem because it can be as severe as losing perhaps millions of dirhams worth of business because you're not able to fulfill customer requests, whether that be through an e-commerce platform that is now no longer responding, or because your main line of business applications have crashed and you have downtime. But even as small as slowdowns on your users' desktops is an impact on their productivity, which can translate into hard dollars. And this is something you want to definitely avoid. If you keep on adding computing power, and then and then you come into a, let's say, Ramadan period where your organization is basically not doing much business, then you have this huge oversupply. So how do we solve this issue? Is we can go to the cloud where we pay for only what we use and we have the ability to scale as we want. So that means that the actual amount of allocated computing power tracks very closely with the actual load, our actual requirement. And this is a huge benefit, and from a total cost of ownership point of view, has huge returns compared to using traditional on-premise architecture. So what is Microsoft Azure? Azure is Microsoft's platform that really tries to address and give you three main benefits. One is hyperscale, in other words, the ability to scale out as large as you could possibly want. Enterprise grade, so these are top computing resources that have an SLA attached to them, so it gives you that peace of mind. It also means that it's been curated with the standards that are often found in the marketplace, such as ISO 27001, as well as audited from external auditors to ensure that the data, the management of that data, is being properly executed. And even more importantly is the fact that just because you're looking at cloud computing doesn't mean that you are committing everything to cloud. Hybrid is going to be the main approach for over 90% of the customers out there. You're not ready, and most organizations cannot realistically move all of their workloads and all of their line of business applications to the cloud. If you are new to the cloud, that is a very scary prospect for you. You want to start trying out some workloads, some less critical workloads onto the cloud, and over time start moving more workloads into the cloud. But there's also going to be situations and scenarios where you still want to keep perhaps, let's say, maybe your confidential customer data on a local database on premise, and still be able to access that from your applications which you have running in the cloud. And that hybrid model is perfectly available using Microsoft Azure. So what do we mean by hyperscale? Today, Azure has over 1 million customers. Okay, and that's increasing by 1,000 new customers every day. And the Microsoft data center footprint is also increasing every year. Last year, I would have told you that there was 8 global data centers, and Microsoft by the end of this year will have 16. So they're increasing very, very rapidly to meet the demand of the users out there. And as you can see from this slide, the amount of data that is stored and processed in Azure is very significant. So the Microsoft data centers, which are run by a division of Microsoft called Global Foundation Services, are very, very impressive data centers. And I invite you to go and take a look at either YouTube, or if you just do a search for Global Foundation Services, you will find actually Microsoft's website that goes into more detail about how they build and operate their data centers. These are data centers which are highly secure, both from a physical and logical point of view. They cover multiple regions around the world. And on top of the actual data centers, there's also a network of content delivery network edge nodes, which give you the option of ensuring that your data is closer to your customers. So if you have static data, what we're talking about here is, let's say, documents, images, videos that you want to ensure are closer geographically to your users, you can also use a service within Azure which allows you to leverage these content delivery network nodes. And for this region, in fact, there is one based out of Doha in Qatar. So an important point for all prospective customers is to understand that Microsoft is 100% committed to the cloud and making very large investments in their global data centers, also ensuring that the amount of bandwidth and the connectivity from around the world is optimum. The bandwidth into the Microsoft data centers is absolutely huge. You will never have an issue regarding bandwidth, which is also one of the reasons why many organizations are choosing to put their mission critical web applications, whether it be web applications for their internal employees or public facing websites, onto Azure, because they're benefiting from that huge bandwidth available into the data centers. I talked about the security, where Microsoft has invested also very heavily, ensuring that apart from the traditional security that you would expect, which includes things like biometric security using fingerprint and retina eye scans, there's also multiple badge as well as role-based access control, so that when the Microsoft engineers need to do any sort of maintenance work, they're only given the exact amount of access required to do that activity, and then that permission is revoked once again. So this is all part of the policies that are adhered to ensure that your data is safe, that the data continues to be yours, and is a very important part of Microsoft's commitment to data privacy. Obviously, Microsoft has chosen their data center locations for various reasons in terms of geopolitical stability, the availability of cooling, of electricity, of internet, and one of the things that they are very committed to is being as green as possible as well, which means building data centers which use the least amount of power and use as much renewable energy as possible. So when we talk about compliance, what does that mean? It means that there's a lot of companies and organizations out there which are very concerned with, how are data centers being run. When we talk about data centers, there are thousands and thousands of them spread across the globe. And whether we're talking about top tier data centers from companies like Microsoft or Google or Amazon or Rackspace, or the small local players, the question that you want to ask these companies is, how are they run, how are they being audited, and how do they comply to international and local standards. So obviously one of the very well-known international standards is the ISO 27001, which dictates how data centers are constructed, how they are run, how the data is stored, etc. And all of the Microsoft data centers comply to ISO 27001. If you look at this slide, you'll see that that the Microsoft data centers comply to a long list of standards, including the strict financial and healthcare industry standards like FISMA and HIPAA in the United States. For more information about this, and Microsoft is very, very transparent about this, I invite you to go to the Azure Trust Center, and you can see that there's the link down there. Either copy down that link or just do a search on the internet for the Azure Trust Center, and you will find the same link which will allow you to get into more detail about this. And this is an important point, because many organizations, perhaps not even the IT team themselves, the IT department, but certainly the management, have concerns about where is that data, how is it being accessed, what securities is Microsoft giving me, what comfort is Microsoft giving me that this data is properly being handled. So you can go there and get all of the answers to your questions. Another very important point to to note here is that when you decide which region you want to use for your data center, and generally for the Gulf region here, most customers are using the European data centers in terms of geographically being closer as well as fast access speed. And for other customers, they use the Southeast Asian data centers as well, the ones located in Singapore, perhaps Hong Kong, and this all depends on the latency that you're using. But what's important to note is that when you do place data or you have your virtual machines running in any of these data centers, your data does not actually flow over outside of that region. So if you're using the European data centers, which are the data centers located in Dublin and in Amsterdam, your data will never leave those two data centers. They will never go to the US, for example. So for a lot of organizations, this is an important point. So what are some of the things that are hosted in these Microsoft data centers? So if we think about things like Xbox Live, you consider that Xbox Live uses over 100,000 of the Azure virtual machines to run these sessions, live gaming sessions. Another very big point is the Olympics. So the Sochi 2014 Winter Olympics were live streamed using the Azure platform, as was the FIFA World Cup. So when you consider 2.1 million viewers simultaneously viewing live video streams, and that this was all being made possible by the Azure platform, it's a very, very impressive feat. So Azure provides services for a number of different areas. If you're a developer, you will have application services that allow you to quickly develop applications without having to reinvent the wheel. So when a developer needs to create an application that takes into account security in terms of sending out notifications to mobile devices, in terms of how do I ensure identity, in terms of centralized identity, I don't have to create all of this from scratch, from zero. This can be all done directly through Azure services. I have different ways of also storing my data. If I need a SQL database, maybe I need a MySQL, or I don't use a structured relational database approach, all of this is available to me as well, whether I want to set it up in a traditional approach as infrastructure as a service, or I want to consume it as platform as a service, where the actual database is already hosted and maintained for me, and I can take care of that, of just consuming the database structure. So that's available. And then, of course, from an infrastructure, which is the more traditional approach of I need to have some virtual machines, I need to have some 4-core, 16 gig of RAM. I want to load up my application and have more control over how that is set up and configured, as well as the operating system patches. I also have that ability. I can do that. I can set up multiple virtual networks to connect to Azure, extending out this data center capability that I have for my on-premises, and view the Azure data center as simply an extension of my own data center. Okay, and that's a very important point, is to think that these resources that I am consuming out in Azure are not perhaps just some invisible cloud service. I can actually see Telnet ping them directly as if they were in my own data center. And if you look at your data center today and the way that you generally run it, you have to take care of all of the layers, right? All the way from the hardware, the networking layer, all the way up to the application layer. Whereas with Azure, you get the ability to choose how you want to consume it. You can have virtual machines where you can have that control over the operating system up until the application layer. You don't have to worry about the hardware. You don't have to worry about the networking on the basic hardware level. To all the way to having, let's say, websites where you can move your application and data directly to Azure and not have to worry about any of the underlying infrastructure at all. So you have the option of consuming Azure services, however it best fits your business model. Hybrid is a very important part here. We talked about that briefly, and that means that I can split actually my servers depending on perhaps my company policy, my organizational policy, or based on the performance requirements that I have. I can have machines and servers on premises and connect that up using the Azure Virtual Networking up into the cloud, so that I can split whether it be my computing power or my data storage. Both models are possible. There are customers who are running hybrid SharePoint workloads, so you can have SharePoint running both on-premise and on the cloud and have them automatically load balance or be a disaster recovery, so that if your on-premise fails, you can revert back to or continue using the Azure cloud to run your operation. So obviously one of the important questions that any organization is going to ask is, why would I move my existing applications to the cloud? There's obviously advantages when it comes to how you manage hardware, in terms of perhaps not requiring to purchase storage and licenses, etc. But a lot of this comes down to also financial. And definitely from a total cost of ownership point of view, we can help you understand and see how operating in the cloud is definitely going to be more cost effective over time than having to have on-premise servers and worrying about all of the pieces we've talked about before, as well as support contracts. But you can very quickly and easily calculate what your estimated spend would be on Azure for infrastructure resources by simply going to the Azure calculator. So if you do a search for Azure calculator, you go to the main Azure website at azure.microsoft.com, you will find an option there for calculator, and you can take a look to see, what are the resources that I require. In this example, we're saying maybe I need 2 medium-sized Windows virtual machines. That means that the operating system for Windows Server is already preloaded and included in the cost. And if I know how much storage that I require and approximately how many transactions and how much information is going to be coming out of the Microsoft data center, I can do a very quick calculation. So I can see that my compute might cost me $268 a month, the storage maybe $6 a month, the bandwidth, etc., and come up with a total figure that I can then compare with what are my total costs for operating the same infrastructure on premise. Obviously, that cost that you're talking about on premise is not just the server hardware, right? It is the server hardware, it's the storage, it's the licensing, it's the maintenance, it's the power, the cooling, etc., etc. So all of those things have to be taken into account. And if you want help with calculating out these expenses, we can definitely do that for you. So let's take a look at some of the use cases and how Azure can help you solve these issues that you might be facing in your organization. And one of the big issues has to do with identity. So increasingly today, when we have our end users that are using multiple types of devices, this whole approach to the consumerization of IT, bring your own device, people are using, whether it be laptops, tablets, smartphones, they want to access the applications that have been exposed and made available by the organization, whether that be Microsoft applications or non-Microsoft applications, it doesn't matter. But we're seeing this myriad of applications and devices now that are required as part of the daily operation of the business. So this causes a very, very large headache usually for IT in terms of how do I manage the identity, how do I manage the access to the different cloud services, these SaaS applications. So there's something that obviously a lot of organizations are already using for identity. And if you're using, like I said, Microsoft or non-Microsoft applications, you usually have an Active Directory sitting on your premise. And if you don't have an Active Directory today, then you're either using another identity platform, or if you don't have any platform whatsoever, I would definitely recommend that you take a look at the benefits of using Active Directory as a centralized identity management platform, which will allow you to have a lot of functionality in terms of understanding how to send out group policies, in terms of controlling access, in terms of creating a single repository to build all of the access controls for all of your users, as well as have a hierarchical approach to create logical groups. so that you can create your departments or different business units within this identity platform, and then be able to manage them not only at a user level but at a group level. So when your users are trying to access, whether it be these Microsoft applications or non-Microsoft applications, the Azure Active Directory can become now your single platform to control access to all of these applications and controlling the users and devices that are trying to access these applications. So your Active Directory today will synchronize with Azure Active Directory, which means that you continue to have a single place to manage all of your identities, while Azure Active Directory is going to provide you with the connectivity and federation to all of these applications in the cloud and give you some nice additional features as well. And what do I mean by that? Well, if you decide, Azure Active Directory actually comes in a number of different flavors, right? And in fact, you can go for a completely free model. So if you're interested to start trying out and playing with what does Active Directory on Azure looks like, you can go today to the Microsoft Azure portal and contract the free tier, the basic tier, which allows you to have Active Directory running in the cloud. It has obviously some limitations in terms of, I cannot go over 500,000 objects, but even for a lot of companies and organizations, this is already going to be beyond what they require. But Active Directory gives you the centralized place in the cloud to manage all of these identities. And one of the flavors of Azure Active Directory is Azure AD Premium. Okay, so this is a more advanced offering for identity access management, which allows you to manage both cloud applications, whether they are SaaS applications like Office 365 from Microsoft, or non-Microsoft applications. So think of Salesforce.com, Box.net, etc. I can control the access to all of these applications using my Azure Active Directory, as well as have some additional functionality to do things like having a user self-service password portal, which is a wonderful feature that will allow you to really reduce the calls to your help desk, to your IT department. Whenever a user has forgotten his password, instead of having to make that phone call and use up time and resources in the organization, they can now reset their passwords by themselves. And it will use a second way of authentication using their mobile phone to ensure that the user is really who they say they are, and then generate a new password for them. The Azure AD Premium also gives you the ability to do things like write back. In other words, any changes that are made by the user on the cloud can be written back to the Active Directory on-premise. And it also gives you the licensing for what you may be aware of or may be familiar with from Microsoft, which is the Forefront Identity Manager or FIM, so that you can actually connect different Active Directories or even non-Microsoft identity platforms to Active Directory, so that you can keep all of these platforms synchronized together. Additionally, when you go for the Azure Active Directory Premium, you get a service level agreement of 99.9% to ensure that that is constantly available. Now, one of the nice things about this is we have a lot of customers that before this was available wanted to put a copy of Active Directory into the cloud. They wanted to have federation services available so that they could have the full single sign-on capabilities. And when we did this, we were deploying, 5-6 servers into the Azure cloud. And some of them, even when they were the early adopters, they were deploying this infrastructure on their premises. And very clearly, when you are starting to adopt cloud, what you don't want to do is start adding servers onto your on-premise infrastructure. So the first step from an Active Directory and a federated approach for these other applications used to be I now deploy 5-6 different servers onto my on-premise. That evolved to I now deploy this infrastructure into Azure, and now with Active Directory Premium on Azure, I don't have to do that at all. I'm actually consuming Active Directory as a service and no longer have to worry about managing these virtual machines that I'm running in the cloud for federation. So this is a huge leap from just even 2 years ago in our ability to control and centralize our identity management without having to worry about infrastructure and without having to worry about administering separate virtual machines even in the cloud. Now, when we talked about using Active Directory Premium to be able to connect to non-Microsoft cloud applications, we take this view of all of these applications and all of these users that we have that are trying to log into different applications. We have the ability to do cloud app discovery, which means that I have a gallery of pre-approved applications that I can now individually give access to different users or groups or departments to say yes, they have access or they do not have access to it using their identity. So it gives IT a lot more control in terms of how your users, what they have access to, and with very little work, because these are applications that are already pre-federated. So when you go to the Azure gallery of SaaS applications, you will actually find a huge list of applications available. So if you look at what are the different ways of actually technically deploying out this solution, you can do authentication with Azure Active Directory using simply a DIRSync. In other words, I take a copy of my username, the passwords, and I can have those objects replicated up to my Azure Active Directory. Or I can do a more federated approach, which is I actually do ADFS and copy those objects into the Azure Active Directory. Okay, those are two different ways of doing this seamless experience for your users so that it looks and feels like single sign-on. Right? It means that if any changes are made in the Active Directory on-premise, it's automatically propagated out, and it means that for any applications that I'm federated to, I can immediately use that new password. As I mentioned, the gallery available on Azure is very, very extensive. If I had done this presentation just 4 months ago, I would have told you that there are approximately 1,000 SaaS applications that are available for you to connect with using Azure Active Directory Premium. That number has grown very, very quickly, and today it's over 2,000 strong. So you can actually go directly to the public Azure website, do a search of the application that you're thinking about connecting with using Azure Active Directory, and you can very quickly find that there. And you'll find that all of the major applications that you are used to using are all there, whether that be Skype, whether that be SAP, whether it be Dropbox. All of these applications are federated and available for you to connect using Azure Active Directory. So imagine the benefits and the power of having a single identity which allows you to access your company resources on-premise, maybe you have an Exchange server on-premise, your SharePoint, as well as all cloud-based SaaS applications. It's a very powerful concept. Now, security is obviously a major topic for most organizations. How do I increase the security, especially for users that might have access to very sensitive applications or applications that have perhaps a degree of confidentiality that I want to ensure are safeguarded. Usernames and passwords are great, however, they're not foolproof. And if I have my typical user that has written down the username and password somewhere, then it's obviously not so secure. So I have a way of doing that. I can, as part of Azure AD Premium, you get another feature which is called Azure Multi-Factor Authentication. So Azure Multi-Factor Authentication, or MFA for short, gives me the ability to now add two-factor authentication to my applications, whether those applications are running on-premise or in the cloud. And because it's being managed by Azure Active Directory, I can turn it on or off for individual users. And what it allows me to do is also report on successful, or perhaps I can find if I'm finding a certain user's account is being constantly attempted for access and is constantly failing, I can then take steps to remedy that. It also allows me to, if I see that there are failures on a login attempt for a user who does not have multi-factor authentication, maybe I can decide to turn multi-factor authentication on because I think this user is perhaps more at risk. Perhaps it's one of these users that has the bad habit of writing his passwords down, or it's a user that frequently travels and has his laptop or his mobile phone in public places. These types of high-risk users are ideal candidates for having multi-factor authentication activated. So multi-factor authentication allows me to use my phone as my second factor device. It basically, the concept of multi-factor authentication, for those of you that are not very familiar with it, is not only something that I know, in other words my username and password, but also something that I own, in this case my mobile phone, right? So anybody now that is trying to access, that has multi-factor authentication activated and wants to access these applications, will not only need to enter their username and password, but using their mobile phone, they will receive a telephone call, or they will receive an SMS, or if they don't have mobile coverage, they can even use a free application on their mobile platform, whether that be Windows Phone, Android, or iOS, to generate a one-time password, and therefore put this one-time password into the portal and then be given access. So the multi-factor authentication can be contracted by itself. You do not need Azure AD Premium for it, but if you do get Azure AD Premium, it's included as part of the service, right? And this is what is going to give you that extra layer of security for your most confidential applications and data. And this can be extended out, by the way, not just to your employees within your organization, but you can use it for external. So if you have extranet type of applications, or you've invited even customers or external users who are collaborating with your applications and data, you can also activate multi-factor authentication for them. So here are the three forms that I have just mentioned. You can have a mobile application, which is very handy when a user does not have mobile coverage, so they cannot perhaps receive that telephone call or the SMS. Or you have a phone call or a text message. And when a user is first activated for multi-factor authentication, the user themselves will do an enrollment process, which allows them to enter their mobile phone number. That will get verified with them. And once they're enrolled, which is a one-time process only, then they will be contacted at that device and by the means that they have decided. Because if a user decides that they prefer receiving an SMS, they can have that as their default communication mechanism. So now let's move on to storage, and Azure provides a lot of solutions from a storage point of view. Storage is one of these things which organizations have a very hard time keeping up with, because storage requirements are exponentially growing year over year, and especially if you are in an industry such as engineering or consulting, where the number of documents that you are generating are very large and it's constantly growing. This is a very big challenge for you to handle. And Microsoft has got several different services available in Azure to handle storage requirements. So obviously, if you are running infrastructure as a service and you have databases, or you require storage to have your documents, your media files, etc., Azure provides you different types of storage in Azure, from blob storage to tables and queues for databases. Blob storage is what you would use to store, your media document files. These are unstructured data, and is also going to be the most inexpensive option for you. Today, we're talking about somewhere in the order of 0.04 cents per terabyte or per gigabyte, sorry, of storage that is being stored in the cloud per month. That's a very, very cost-effective price for storage, which has come down also greatly over the last year. So I can tell you that approximately 6 to 9 months ago, that price was about double. So as time goes on, these types of resources and this computing, the price for these computing units are constantly coming down. You should also be aware that when we talk about the different services available for infrastructure as a service, clearly a company like Amazon always comes up in the conversation. And what you should be aware is that Microsoft has a public commitment that says that anytime Amazon drops their prices for any of their computing resources, Microsoft will do the exact same thing on the exact same day. And if you look back at the announcements of Amazon dropping their prices, you will also notice that on the exact same day, Microsoft has dropped to match those prices. So you'll never pay more than Amazon prices. And if you look at third-party analyst reports, especially from a storage point of view, you will find that storage, Microsoft is the only cloud provider that in storage tests have had 0 read-write errors when it comes to cloud storage. So that should give you also the comfort of knowing that Microsoft's storage in Azure is the most reliable for your requirements and the most high performing as well. So today, I shouldn't say today, probably 6 months ago actually, this data, they've already had 25 trillion objects stored in the Azure cloud. And the nice thing about it is that you use what's called thin provisioning, which means that if you think that you project over the next few months that you need, let's say 2 terabytes of space in Azure, you can allocate that space today. However, you're only going to pay for the actual storage that you use. That thin provisioning is very important. You're not paying for what you're not using. The whole concept of using the cloud and using Azure is that you're only paying for what you use. Now, you have several options when it comes to storage. You can choose it to be locally redundant. So anything that you store as a locally redundant data storage will immediately have 3 copies of it made in that data center in different racks or different domains, as Microsoft calls it, which means that if there's any corruption or failure of that, there's always an additional 2 copies available in that data center. However, for a small increment in the actual price for storage, you can also choose to have geo-redundant storage, which means that that storage is actually going to be replicated to the other data center in the same region. And using Europe as an example, if you have your data stored in the Dublin data center, if you've activated geo-redundant storage, then you'll also have another 3 copies made in the Amsterdam data center. So that's a very, very high level of availability to you and a very, very high SLA that's attached to that as well. And you should be aware that as far as I know, every single Azure feature and capability has an SLA attached to it unless it's in preview mode. And that's a very important point, because when you look at services from other data centers, they might attach SLA levels to things like virtual machines, but not to all of their services and components. So you need to be aware that Microsoft is the only cloud vendor that will attach SLAs to all of their generally available services in Azure. You might also have the situation where you want to have data available to be perhaps read by other applications, or to be even manipulated and analyzed by different users, but you don't want to touch the primary data store, which is being used perhaps by your applications running in the cloud. And that's where you can also have a service called read-only access of your geographically redundant storage. So that's the RAGRS option that you see there on the last line. SQL databases, obviously something that is very, very popular. There are 2 ways that you can have SQL in the cloud. So you can actually run a full instance of SQL Server, whether that be the standard or enterprise editions. You can run that directly in the cloud as a traditional infrastructure as a service I go and I actually configure and install SQL Server, maybe it will be 2012, 2014, directly in a virtual machine that I have provisioned and set up in Azure. Or if I don't want to bother with all of that, I can consume SQL databases as a service from Azure. Okay, and that means that I don't have to worry about the licensing. I don't have to worry about setting up SQL Server in a virtual machine. That's already taken care of for me. And by the way, if you decide to have a full copy of SQL Server in a virtual machine as infrastructure as a service, you also have two options from a licensing point of view. If you already have SQL Server on-premise, you can bring your license with you and use that in the cloud, or you can contract the SQL Server on Azure with the licensing included in your subscription price. So it's very, very flexible that way. Now, there's a new feature that's been made available which really answers a lot of very common use case scenarios that customers have. So wouldn't it be nice if I have a file storage area within Azure that I can map to directly from my applications or even directly from my desktops? So by using a universal naming convention where I do // server name / resource name, I can actually access my files which are being stored and hosted in Azure. And this is very, a very useful service available now in Azure, which is great for a lot of different scenarios, but it would not be used for high IOPS type of scenarios. So maybe you're a developer and you have a set of tools that you want to be have available from any location wherever you happen to be working, or for your applications to be able to share shared resources. You can create these Azure file storage areas which can be accessed using either the REST API, as the rest of the Azure storage, blob storage is used, or you can access it using standard SMB protocol, which is obviously very, very useful if you're trying to access it from your desktop or even from Mac or Linux machines. You can do that directly. So I mentioned Azure Files. It uses SMB 2.1. You can also access it using the REST API. And it's a very, very easy way to provision storage in the cloud and have that basically accessible from anywhere and use it as if it was just a file server. There's another storage solution that Microsoft has, which has surprised a lot of people who are not familiar with it. So if you are currently in the market, or will be in the next, in the upcoming future, for a storage SAN type of appliance, or you're needing to expand the amount of on-premise storage that you have, Microsoft has a solution for you that combines the benefits of Azure storage with a physical appliance that you would install in your on-premise data center. Now, if you look at how storage is taken care of on-premise today, it's a very complex, it's a very expensive proposition. Generally, we have a SAN storage system that usually has a secondary disk-based archiving storage, which is then dumped off to tapes, and that tapes get sent off-site for secure. Now, this entire chain of events is not only very time consuming, it's also of course very expensive. And I've had customers who have explained to me that their backups are taking more than 24 hours to complete. And they're doing daily backups, which means that their backups are constantly overlapping additional backups. And it's a crazy concept to think, but it does happen to organizations today. And the restore process can be just as painful. So whether you need to restore one file or a set of files or directories, the restore time can be as painfully long. And if that requires you to bring back tapes from an offsite storage location, those restore times can be unacceptably slow. So when you need to respond quickly to your organization's requirements to ensure that all of your data is being safely stored and is always accessible as quickly as possible, there is a more intelligent way of doing this. And Microsoft has solved this problem by having purchased a company a year and a half ago, almost 2 years ago now, called Store Simple. So what is Store Simple? Store Simple. Store Simple is that appliance, a 2U high appliance that has every component completely redundant in it, and that means that the controllers, the disks are completely redundant. You would have to have an entire box failure, or perhaps you would have a catastrophe in your data center, such as a fire, to take out the entire box. And you combine that with Azure storage, which means that from a total cost of ownership compared to your traditional storage model, it's a 60 to 80% savings in total cost of ownership compared to the traditional on-premise. Means that this entire chain and this vicious cycle that you have with primary storage, secondary storage, tape backup, offsite goes away. You never have to worry about tape backup again. This is an enormous advantage, and the customers that read about Store Simple find that to be one of the most compelling reasons to look at adopting Store Simple with Azure. So how does it work? When you have the Store Simple device, okay, let me move on to the next one and then I'll come back to this slide. So this is the Store Simple device itself. It's an iSCSI device, okay, with multiple gigabit Ethernet ports available to it. So what's very important for you to know about this is that it's highly secure because all of the data, whether it be at rest or in transit, is encrypted, that you are the owner of that key for that encryption, and that all of the data that is then stored in Azure is not accessible to anyone because the private key is on the appliance itself, and that is under your control. Now, what it means is if you look at the use cases for this type of storage, it is not intended to replace tier 1 fast storage that you might be using for high IOPS types of applications. So if you have databases that you're using that are being frequently accessed, or virtual machines that require very fast access to disks, this is not the solution for you. The target use cases are for file servers, for example, SharePoint libraries are excellent, and archives as well. And in a typical example that I've had with customers is, this requirement to have, for example, AutoCAD files, which might have multiple sub-files under a project. You might have different layers, like say lighting or the floor plans or whatever it is, and this AutoCAD will fail if it does not find all of the files in a library. And in many customer organizations where they are archiving using retention policy, and older files, let's say files older than 2 or 3 months, are automatically getting sent out to a DR site or a secondary archival subsystem, then it automatically breaks AutoCAD or any other application that is expecting to find the file available. And Store Simple solves this issue, because the way it works, and we'll now move to how it works, is that you have, depending on the appliance that you have a certain amount of storage which is going to be encrypted and deduplicated right on the device, allowing you to store a large amount of data directly on the appliance, which is therefore locally available and is referred to as the working set of data. So that data is always available to you. And when the data is first being populated onto the device, it's being stored on the SSD tier, on the SSD drives of that appliance that's on premise. Then what it will do is, through a deduplication, it will immediately drop down the amount of storage required, and it's still being stored on the SSD. But when that SSD tier fills up, it will drop down through the deduplication and compression to the SAS drives, once again still on the device on premise, so that you are saving up to 5 times the amount of data required, depending on obviously the file type. Now if that tier also fills up, then the objects, the file objects, are going to be tiered off to Azure. And you have the option to do both local snapshots right on the appliance, okay, which you can set the timing for these local snapshots, as well as the cloud snapshots. So you will always have a full copy of all of the data that is on that device, and any overflow data always in Azure. That means that if you're storing, let's say, 20 terabytes worth of data locally, but you actually have a 50 terabyte entire data set, that entire data set is going to be in the cloud, and the device will manage 50 terabytes. In fact, if you have a file that is no longer physically on that appliance but is in the cloud, and your users are looking at the file listing, they will see all of the files, irrespective of its physical location. And that is the great advantage of this solution over a traditional NAS or SAN storage system, because it means that these applications which are dependent on having access to these files will always see that file available. And if that file is not physically on that device and it's being requested, it will be streamed down in real time. Now, if a user accesses a file that is not on that, as you can see, it will be streamed up as you see from the diagram up there, back up to the SSD tier, and then the algorithm continues again. So it has this intelligent algorithm which will understand the files that are not being frequently used will start dropping in tier until it finally gets tiered off to the Azure cloud. Let's move on to the next topic of how you can leverage Azure for your business. So a lot of you might be looking at doing things like VDI or virtual desktop for your organization. So you can centralize and centrally manage your desktops and your user desktops from your server locations. Some of you have been using Citrix perhaps. Now these are obviously great solutions to be able to centrally administer and manage what your users are seeing, the applications that they get to run, but they're also quite costly, usually from a costing point of view, from licensing, as well as hardware required to hold and host these applications. So there is an option in Azure for you to have Azure Remote App. And this is based on the Remote Desktop Services protocol, which if you have used terminal services in the past, it's very similar. But the Remote App has got some very important improvements that from terminal services from the past, and allows you to host your applications in the Azure cloud and then distribute the applications to any amount of users. And this can be done as full desktop, as remote desktop sessions, the more traditional approach, or you can actually publish for them the applications that they have available to them, which is a wonderful way of being able to distribute out client applications for, let's say, ERP platforms. So if you're, let's say, running Dynamics or you're running SAP, and instead of going to each machine and installing that client application on it and then having to update it every time there's perhaps an updated patched version, a new version, you can do this centrally on Azure. You host your application on there, you make it available to the users that you want to. They can therefore authenticate themselves. They will get a window with all of the applications that they have available to them and run it as if it was a native application. So instead of being a full screen desktop that they take control of, they can run these applications as if it was installed on their local hard drive. Now, obviously, the benefits of this are multiple. Number one is that you are still centrally managing their application. So these are the upgrade cycle, the ability to personalize what they see is made simpler and a lot faster. Second is that you get to protect your data. The data that is stored is going to be stored centrally on Azure so that there's no risk of that data actually being stored on the user's computer, which is a huge benefit. If that computer is stolen or lost, then none of that data is actually lost. It's all stored simply. Now, the actual architecture of how that looks like is I can either use pre-published applications such as the Office applications, or I can publish my own applications. It is then available on a variety of different devices. It's not just Windows PCs. There are applications for Microsoft Remote App that is available for Mac OS X. It's available for Android devices, for iOS devices. I can connect from any of these using the RDP protocol and actually see the application that I need to use, which means that I can actually have an iPad user use the full copies of, let's say, Office for Windows directly on their iPad device. And obviously that is something that's very impactful to see. There's obviously Mac for Office. There's also the Office for iPad. But if you want to give them the full copy of Office for Windows, let's say the Office 2013 Professional Plus, you can give that to them on an iPad using Remote App as an application. All right, the authentication can go in once again through Azure Active Directory, the service that we had discussed before, which would be using therefore the exact same credentials that they're used to using on their on-premises. So if they have that activated, they don't even actually have to authenticate, because it will know from their logged in AD username and password that they already have access to this. So the user experience is very smooth without additional logon requirements. Okay, so what about organizations that have sensitive company data and are trying to find a way to secure that and ensure that it does not leave the organization? Very frequently referred to as data leakage protection or data loss protection or prevention. This is a topic that is hot on a lot of organizations' lists, and the way that they've been handling it today, and I've seen this with many customers, is taking a very traditional approach of blocking access to websites that might give the employee the opportunity to leak this data. This could be blocking access to email providers such as Gmail or even Hotmail, or cloud storage lockers, whether that be Dropbox or OneDrive or any of the thousands available out there. But the problem with that, of course, is that there are many thousands of them. So how sure are you that you're going to be able to block all of these cloud storage and cloud email providers? It's probably highly ineffective way of doing it. I've also seen customers using Active Directory policies to push out policies to lock out using the USB ports on a user's computer, so they cannot attach a thumb drive or an external hard drive to store that data. And this is really what we call the slippery slope, because you will never be able to properly close off all of the different holes that are possible for data to come out. So there's a much more intelligent approach for this, and that is, how do I actually protect this information directly at the source and give that power to the user? So it's not an IT function, it is now a user function. And I can do that using RMS, or Rights Management Service. And this is a service available on Azure that you can use to protect both your emails or your files directly. And how does that work? So in these screenshots, I'll give you a very quick example of how you do this. You might have a document that you want to protect. You can set a policy on it that has been created for you, that can also be automatically applied depending on your user or department, for example. And then I choose the amount of permission that I want to give for the recipients of this document or email. So perhaps I want to say that yes, it can be viewed but cannot be printed, for example, or cannot be forwarded. And depending on the protection level that you put, you can also stop users from doing a print screen of their screen, so that they cannot actually save that in another format. Then I can send this document or this email to whether it be internal employees or external. And if they're internal, they will automatically get authenticated and be able to see it if they have the right privilege levels. And for external employees, they go through the same process. They would need to have an account that you can either set up for them, or that they can register for a Microsoft account and then have access through a web interface to consume that data or the email in question. So it's a very powerful technology, and allows you to also consume it from mobile devices. And if you have a Windows phone, the RMS is built in. In other words, if you receive an encrypted email or an encrypted document, you do not need any additional software for it. It will work with the native email client that's built into it. For other mobile platforms such as iOS and Android, you can get third-party applications to open up RMS protected documents and emails. Or you can also use the web interface, which means that the user in question would receive a notification or the email, they can then log in through the web portal and be able to authenticate themselves that way and view the document. Now, the documents that can be protected today are all of the Office documents as well as PDF files, but it doesn't stop there. If you want to protect other documents from other applications, you can do that. There are additional plugins available from third-party companies to protect that. But you can use the out-of-the-box policies that are available in Rights Management Service, or even create your own policies to apply those to the emails and documents that you want to protect. So the advantage of this, of course, is that once you protect the email or the document, it doesn't matter where that document travels. If I send it to my friend, if that friend cannot properly authenticate themselves back to the RMS server, they will not be able to view or consume the content. And this is the more intelligent way of being able to protect company sensitive data rather than ones that I talked about before. Now, there's a lot of other services that you can leverage in the cloud. Like I said, we will not be able to cover all of them, but one of them, for example, is Azure Site Recovery. So if you are interested in disaster recovery and today you have your data center and you want to understand how can I more cleanly fail over from one data center to another, to my DR site, Azure can give you that capability. Using Hyper-V Recovery Manager, you can detect if there has been a failure or connection issue in one data center and automatically spin up and start using the DR or replicated virtual machines in a DR site so that you continue your operations. Now, this can also be done so that the DR is actually the Azure site itself, so that you don't have to worry or depend on a secondary site or a DR site specifically. Okay, so that's another feature available in Azure. And to be honest with you, like I said, there are so many different things that we could cover and that we will start covering more in depth as deeper dives in future webinar sessions. If you see any of these topics that could be interesting for you, really almost all organizations can benefit from using Azure, whether it be using it as infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. Please contact us. We would be more than happy to discuss your requirements with you and to see how Azure can help you out, as well as be able to do some business case analysis for you so that you can present that to management to get approval to move forward with starting to consume these cloud services. Whether that be using media services to do things like the video streaming or live broadcasting that's available to you. You can use search. There are the websites, which is one of the more common ones, or backup. Backup is a very common requirement for users, whether they're wanting to back up their on-premise servers and user desktops or their virtual machines directly within Azure. You can do that using Azure Backup and using standard tools that you're familiar with today. So thank you for joining us this morning, and we will open it up now to any questions you have. Please use the instant messaging